Awesome. Well, I'm really happy to have you here. It's always nice to have a buddy when walking through forecasts and things for the month. And I always like to give the guest a moment to introduce themselves. And I like to frame the question with, how would you like our listeners to know you today? What's feeling most forward about who you are and how you're showing up? And then I think from there we'll start diving into astro. Do you mind kicking us off that way?
Sure, no problem. Yeah. I am ZamboniFunk. I am a musician and astrologer. I think that those two crafts are the same thing. And so it's all about, so I study rhythmic cycles of timing primarily. And so, so I come from a funk and soul musical background. And so the way that I approach astrology is very much from the standpoint of like, if you can find where the beat is, then you can groove along with it in a way that is more productive than perhaps trying to swim upstream or this kind of thing. So I do music fairly seriously. You can find me on Spotify, Tidal, Pandora, and all this kind of stuff, as well as doing astrology forecasts regularly. I just rounded 5 years on regular astrology forecasts. So yeah, I've been studying rhythm and timing for a good long time now.
That's awesome. And I love, talking about it as rhythm as well, which I'm a dance artist, not a musician, but
Mm,
I love the framing it within the context of rhythm makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm going to probably steal that from you in the future.
sure, yeah. But
um,
I would love if people would use this framework, And one of the things, because like I do electional astrology pretty seriously,
mhm.
so you know, I look at the skies to see what's going on, and then we'll sort of like try to time my major releases and launches or other things with nice moments in the sky. And the way that I always conceptualize that is like, because you end up not doing stuff at a lot of times because the skies, especially these days, are wild. It's just really wacky stuff going on in the sky. And so what I always end up saying to clients as well as to myself is the rests are as important as the notes. And so if you don't move at a certain time, sometimes that is more strategically beneficial than just trying to go, which is kind of the culture that we live in.
For sure. Yeah. Even just the concept of being like, now is not the best time is like completely countercultural, because now is always the best time in the
For sure.
overculture. So I think yeah, it's a nice practice in and of itself. So today we're going to kind of swim through, tread lightly, or talk ourselves through the astro for April 2023. Are there any sort of like big picture thoughts or moments that you want to like bring to the table before we start getting into the weeds and the nitty gritty? March 2023 was a pretty epic month as far as a lot of big things shifting, a lot of sort of rare astrological things happening all at once. But how are you sort of coming into April from your perspective?
Sure. So I think that we have to like zoom out in a big way. So we are at the beginning now of a 200-year cycle. And that 200-year cycle is rooted to Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions, which happen are now going to happen in air signs and had been happening in earth signs for 200 years prior to this, right? And so we're at the beginning of this cycle. And then also Saturn has just moved out of Aquarius. And so now we're beginning a 3-year cycle there. And not only that, but also Pluto has moved into Aquarius from Capricorn. And so that's another 20-year situation that we're going to be looking at here. And not only that, but at the end of the year last year, we had this Mars retrograde in Gemini, which was just all of the Mars in Gemini that you could ever handle. And that went on for a really long time. So by the time that we get to, and so as you mentioned, March was a major transitional period, right? So that was when we had Pluto moving into Aquarius. It's when we had Saturn moving into Pisces. It's when we had Mars finally getting out of Gemini. And so the way that I had on my podcast, What is the Time, I have Cameron Allen and Palace Augustine on regularly to do quarterly forecasts. And so the way that we conceived of winter time this year was very retrospective. There was a Mars retrograde, there was a Mercury retrograde. It was the very end of Pluto and Capricorn and this kind of stuff. And so then once we get into March, then it's the transition point. It's the transition from looking back to now looking forward into the future, right? Because whenever we're looking at something like a 200-year cycle, that's so long. It's not going to be a moment of like, okay, now like, yesterday was a whole different vibe and today we're like there's a transitional period. And so March kind of exemplifies that transitional period. And so then by the time we get to April, then it's like, okay, here we are. We're in the new thing. We've got Mars in Cancer. We've got Saturn in Pisces. We've got Pluto in Aquarius. And so what? You know? And so I feel like that is really, and this whole quarter, I feel like really sort of like pushes in that direction of like, okay, now we're doing the thing. We're going to move forward now. So how are we going to do that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. And also with we've had these Aries lunations, like the sun moving Aries, Jupiter and Aries, like there is a lot of that sort of like
Mm-hmm.
beginning energy that put like, talking about that push and that's a very it's an energy that's really like rising up to meet a question like, so what? And it's like, we'll show you. So there's a lot of like energy
Mm-hmm.
response around that too. So I like that framing. Um, something that was coming up when talking about the March Aries new moon was just sort of like the beginning of the beginning of the beginning. And so in that also like
Mm.
coinciding with a lot of these sort of bigger picture shifts like you summarized so eloquently feels really, really appropriate. Um, all right. I think we're ready to dive into week one. Does that suit you? Is there anything else you want
Yeah,
to
let's
say
do it.
about big picture framing? Um,
Well, one thing quickly about big picture framing, just thinking about like Aries time as being like the beginning of the beginning of the beginning is the way that you said it, right? And so that is true. And with that new moon in Aries, then we had Jupiter there as well. And so there's this idea of growth and like possibility and optimism and like, like we can do anything with this, right?
mhm.
But then what we've got coming later in the month is we start the eclipse series in Aries. And so we're going to start having eclipses for 2 years in Aries. And so this kind of gives me the feeling that this new moon that we had that wasn't eclipsed, it was at 0 degrees of Aries, that felt very possible and like anything can happen and this kind of stuff. It's a little bit like Trash Jones said uh in her 20s, she was like, anything is possible. And now it's like, anything is possible. It's a little bit like that,
Right. It's
like
like the difference between
with the
being
eclipses.
19 and 29. Very different.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel like once we start getting these eclipses in Aries, there's going to have to be some kind of restructuring. Like it's not going to go in the direction that you thought it was going to go at the time of the new moon.
That makes sense. It's more like, oh, we're at the beginning again. Oh, now we're at the beginning again. Are we still at the beginning? Like kind of like always having to like kind of come back and reframe in that way.
Totally.
I
Hmm.
like that. Thank you for bringing that to the table.
And one thing
Um,
that is good to remember in a 200-year cycle is that we in our human bodies are going to be at the beginning for the rest of our lives, right?
right.
So we are continually going to be at the beginning. So how can we deal with that? How can we like live in that in some kind of way?
Yeah, we're not going to get to the middle of this Pluto cycle. Like that's not like,
We're not.
or there's, like, that's not going
The
to happen.
Saturn Jupiter.
Yeah, the Saturn Jupiter is what I meant. Sorry. And yeah, we're not going to make it there. And I think something that perspective or like encasing our experience within eons is always a really useful thing for humans to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so the first thing that I have for the outline for week one is that on Monday, April 3rd, at least in my sort of like time land intersection, Mercury is going to enter Taurus. And then, of course, immediately square Pluto within a couple of hours because Pluto is also sitting at the beginning of Aquarius, like you just discussed. And Mercury has been moving through Aries. And I find that the shift from any sign to another sign is always, the signs don't naturally have anything in common. They're not like sharing a lot of qualities. But Aries to Taurus, I find it sometimes be like a pretty significant drop or a big change in pace for things
Mhm.
that we're used to. How are you thinking about Mercury in Taurus this go around, and then also that immediate square to Pluto?
Sure. Well, there's a dignity change in rulership, which I think is really um, more beneficial than the transits make it look. Because you look at that square to Pluto, and not only a square to Pluto, but also a conjunction to the North Node, and you're like, uh-oh, right? It doesn't look, it looks, mm, at very least, the way that I like to think about Pluto a lot of times would be like, it's like the funhouse mirror. And so you look into the mirror and there's this like distorted image that comes back at you, and that can be confusing, and maybe that can be alarming, and maybe it can like generate all these like weird intense feelings in you. Pluto can be associated with obsession and jealousy and these kinds of things, right? And so you see that Mercury, and then Mercury's on the North Node also, and the North Node wants to do more of whatever it touches. There's like a kind of greedy component to it, like a hungry ghost. It's never enough. It's never enough, right? And so if you combine that with the potential for like body dysmorphia and the kind of thing that like the funhouse mirror can generate, then that looks like it can be a problem here, right? But we can also see that Mercury in Aries is ruled by Mars. And so Mars is in Cancer. And so even though Mars is not in Gemini anymore, and we love to see Mars moving out of the retrograde shadow and out of that square with Neptune, where it's like angry and confused and that sort of stuff, right? We see that Mars in Cancer isn't particularly comfortable. Mars doesn't like being in Cancer necessarily. It's a situation where, with Mars wants to be like action oriented and this kind of thing. And the moon wants to, Cancer is ruled by the moon. And so the moon tends to want to sort of like nurture or hug, or there's a kind of sensitivity or soft things and these kinds of things, right? And so you put Mars in Cancer and you get something like, I'll do it when I feel like it, right? And so that combined with the urgency of a Mercury in Aries, it's not my favorite, But then you see Mercury moving into Taurus there, and even though it's with the North Node and square to Pluto and all this, it's also there with Venus, and Venus rules Taurus, and so there's a kind of calm. I don't know if calm is the right word for it, because Venus is also conjunct Uranus, right? And so, and I think that Venus conjunct Uranus, we're going to see more of that, especially later in the year once we get to that Venus retrograde in Leo. That's going to square that Uranus a bunch of times and this kind of thing. So calm maybe isn't the right word here, but there's a kind of comfort in this
Mhm.
place. Also, Mercury has decanic dignity, in that is to say that in one of the systems, Mercury rules that first decan of Taurus, which kind of gives it a little bit of like the way that Austin Coppock talks about a planet in decanic dignity is it has a superpower. And so it might not, and you might not even have a lot of like comfort in that placement, but there's a special superpower that comes with that. And so Mercury's superpower at the very beginning of Taurus there tends to be toward the end of planning, or like thinking things through in some kind of way, and thinking through, if we're thinking Venus in Taurus and Venus in Taurus with Uranus, then that's going to want to shake up our sense of value, or our sense of what things are worthwhile and meaningful and this kind of thing. And so one of the things that Palace brought up in my most recent quarterly forecast was this idea of sort of like changing our idea of what the good life is. And so, if we can change our idea of what the good life is, then maybe we don't have to be quite as dependent on the global capitalist network. We can find the beauty and simplicity and this kind of thing. So I wonder if Venus or Mercury at the beginning of Taurus might be able to find ways to actually put it on the schedule to go out and do springtime things and like smell the flowers and this kind of thing. You know, like just yesterday I was out smelling flowers and there were all these people walking by being like, who the fuck is this dude? But at the same time I was like
This is
having a
what we
lovely
should all
time
be
near the tree.
doing.
Right, exactly. It smelled wonderful. And so you know, that sense of just be here now, I feel like is really plausible with that Mercury in Taurus in a way that it wasn't there with Mercury in Aries.
I think that makes sense. It's also making me think. I was just listening to a podcast with Francis Weller and talking about the difference between these primary satisfactions and secondary satisfactions. The
Hmm.
primary satisfactions being a sense of belonging, or um, connected to like our village or our community, our connection to nature, our connected to oneness, and all these are like primary satisfactions. But we live in a culture that so like minimizes and does not offer those to us, and like if they're hard to come by, that we then move towards secondary satisfactions in an attempt to get that sense of belonging and connection and oneness, which
Mm.
can often manifest in, you know, consumerism or that sense of like I never have enough, because we're trying to like fill an appetite with a food that isn't meant to satisfy it. And something
Mm.
about that feels like it's relating to what you're saying. It's like, you know, stopping and smell the roses is like meeting a primary satisfaction, that I'm connected to the innate like beauty of the world, and like I'm a part of the beauty of the world, and there's a pace that goes with that belonging and that sense of care and trust. um
Mm-hmm.
and then also Pluto, you know, having that like north node, that Pluto could also just be like maybe not everyone is getting that message, like other people are maybe not able to accurately assess what that is, or like how much they have or what they need, or you know, are translating to the material in a different way potentially. um but yeah, I
Yeah,
like.
there's definitely the possibility here for a feeling of lack, you know. So the north node never really feels like it has enough, and so Mercury with that north node might get into that place where it's like, oh no, oh no. And then you know, especially with Mercury square Pluto as well, you might be able to overlook the nice things that actually are going on. And so so that's a real possibility there, especially if we're coming on off, you know, we're on the heels of all this stuff in Aries. And I think one of the things that not only consumerism, but I think one of these secondary pleasures that you're talking about here might also be achievement, right? And so this like individual achievement of like I did the thing and now look at me and this kind of stuff, right? So Aries is very big go energy, especially with Jupiter there, right? Like let's do it and let's make it successful and be great and all of this kind of thing, right? And so um coming off of that and then going into Taurus and feeling this sense of lack or this sense of loss or something like that might be a little bit emotional in some kind of strong way. And so I would really take this opportunity to smell the roses, to put your feet on the earth, to do the Taurus things, right? To embody in a kind of way, embody pleasure or um, connectedness in the way that you were talking about. I think that that is really well indicated here.
Yeah, I agree. And think too, like the kinds of logistics or the kinds of planning that Mercury would be doing in Taurus are different than what Mercury would be doing in Aries. Or like it's, you know, the work of like building a house, like a material, like very physical embodied thing, or like building a garden or an ecology is different than building a blog post, right? Like the energy and the
Mm.
logistics needed for them are different. And thinking of like Taurus as such a material, such a dense, such an embodied sign, that like the things we might find, that we're like, what are the things that we're exchanging or communicating about or having to do those logistics and planning for, like might have like that more like dense quality or be oriented around them. And I think trying to meet them with that more embodied pace, that I'm going to smell the roses while I'm doing this thing, because I'm only here at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning of this for my entire life, I think could be a good reminder.
Sure, sure.
Do you feel ready to move towards full moon in Libra vibes?
Sure, sure. Yeah, you're driving the boat here.
I just want to make sure that I didn't leave any thoughts on the table. So, um, depending on where you are, the full moon, it could be happening on April 5th or April 6th. But the sleep of April 5th, 6th will be full moon in Libra. And I believe this is the last kind of lunation that we'll have in Libra before it's going to be eclipse time. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. And we've got big eclipses coming later in the year when it comes to Libra stuff. But at this point, we're still just chugging along, doing Libra stuff as you will.
Yeah, for sure. How are you thinking about this full moon? I feel this last hurrah moon in Libra.
Sure. Well, I mean, Venus is still in Taurus at this point, you know? And so one of the things that's really annoying about Venus in dignity is that when Venus is in Taurus, then it's averse to Libra. And so Venus can't see that moon in the way that you like want it to. But like this you know, the moon in Libra is going to be opposite to, it's approaching this opposition to Jupiter as well, and so we're coming into that Jupiter Kazemi in Aries. And so, you know, so we've still got this like Jupiter growth excitement kind of energy going on here, especially, you know, I'm thinking about Jupiter as being sort of optimistic or excitable or this kind of thing. And then at the same time, Venus in Taurus is like comfortable, able to, and ruling that moon, right, is like able to do the Venus things here. So it really feels like there's this you know, the stuff still feels possible in this moment, and it feels like things want still can move forward in some kind of way. As always with a full moon, you'll want to take a look at what was going on at the new moon in Libra, the last new moon in Libra that we had 6 months ago prior to this. And you'll want to maybe take a look at the last full moon in Libra that we had as well. So because the moons operate on this monthly cycle, but then there's also kind of like this wider year-long cycle that is going on here as well. And so especially if you've got planets in Libra or you've got angles in Libra or something like this, then this will be a moment to, you know, with the full moon, there's usually some kind of culmination or some kind of like it's brightly visible, the thing has come to fruition in some kind of way. And so but like seeing the benefics looking good here and this kind of thing, you know, Jupiter is combust and all this kind of thing, so it's not our like most exciting, most favorable Jupiter energy. But if we're thinking about a lunation, then we're mostly going to be looking at the luminaries here. And so it's a little bit like the sun just kind of gets to absorb some of that Jupiter and gets to be a sun Jupiter thing rather than like worrying about Jupiter so much, you know. And the sun is super comfortable in Aries. The sun looks great in Aries. And so even with the moon in opposition and this kind of stuff, like it doesn't really feel that bad. It feels like, you know, kind of exciting in some kind of way.
Yeah, I agree. It has such a we have, always with like full moon lunations, we have that sort of primary tension of like opposing signs and also the luminaries opposing each other. Like there's this natural like tension of opposability. And I feel like, but like what you're saying, like having the ruler of the moon being super like sort of like dignified and held up. And then also we have this like kind of whisper of Jupiter from the side and also a really strong sun. It's almost like we're able to sort of deal with some of the core tension of Aries and Libra in a really potentially like reconciliatory way, like that kind of me, we tension, or we think of like what is social, what is individual, sort of like kind of bridging them in a way that feels like it's potentially like sober and grounded, but also positive. It feels like it has like
Mm.
more of like a bridge to it, since those benefics have that sort of like connecting quality, in a sense, as opposed to them feeling sort of like harshly opposed. It feels like there's like a softening or like potentially a bridge opportunity there.
Yeah, I think that connection and bridge is a really good look for Libra kind of all the time. I don't know that I would use the word sober here. I was thinking that this looks like a good party moon,
Mm.
you
I was
know?
thinking that second decan of Libra, like that Saturn influence of that sort of like always being like, should we commit to this or not? And maybe it's committing to the party. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Saturn's in Pisces at this point, right? So, You know, we're and that's one of the things that we're going to be finding more and more with the Saturn stuff as we go through time here, is that it's less Saturny, it's less rules and hierarchies and authorities and this kind of thing, and it's going to be more Pisces stuff, right? More of this kind of like feelings and imagination and mystery and all this kind of stuff. It looks like it wants to come through in a strong way. Um, so yeah, the and I think that the connective, like it's a little bit like social lubrication here. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So I wouldn't necessarily go sober with it, but definitely like there's a sense of like, yeah, let's do it. We got this. You know, like that feeling comes through here for sure.
Totally. Maybe the Saturnian influence be more like providing structure of a bridge as opposed to sobriety.
Mm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is there anything else that you want to say about this full moon in Libra? I'm personally feeling kind of excited about it. It sounds like you are too.
Yeah, I think that it's one of the nicer moons that we get in the year. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's ruled by a beneficent dignity, you know, like it's not getting messed up. Like it's got this square from Mars. It's the that square is separating at this point. We've got Mars in Cancer and an overcoming square to the moon in Libra. And so that's like a little annoying or something like this. But by and large, you know, relative to some of the lunations that we're going to deal with this year, like this one is pretty nice.
Yeah, I think so too. The next kind of stop that we'll be making, I think week two, we'll have on April 11th, we'll have like Venus is going to enter Gemini, and then also the sun is
Mhm.
going to conjoin Jupiter in Aries. So we'll have that Kazemi that you were talking about earlier. And then Venus entering Gemini, of course, will have a pretty big dignity shift for Venus. And then also Venus will very soon after that square Saturn because Saturn is now in Pisces. How are you
Mhm.
conceptualizing or thinking about the shift for Venus?
Sure. So Venus moving into Gemini puts Venus into Mercury rulership. And so these two are now exchanging signs. And so there's some debate as to whether or not that constitutes a mutual reception because they're not making an aspect to one another, but at least they're sort of like in contact with one another in this kind of way, right? So Mercury is doing Taurus things still and is still involved in that kind of embodied, tangible sensory kind of space. And then Venus is now moving into Gemini. So I think that this looks really good for Gemini because Gemini has had a rough time with things, with Mars there and all of this. And one of the things that I've been thinking about with Gemini and kind of mutable signs generally is that so Saturn has moved into Pisces, and that is it's likely to lengthen the Mars retrograde in Gemini thing. So Mars was retrograde in Gemini for about 8 months, and that feels like a really long time, especially for a Mars transit, right? But kind of the way that I've been thinking about that is like, so Mars is sharp and pokey and this kind of stuff, right? So it's a little bit like, and Mars, sometimes that discomfort can be motivating. So it's a little bit like if you sit down in a chair and then you find that there's a tack in the chair and you're like, ah, and so that gets you up out of the chair immediately, right? It's strongly motivating. And then you look down and you see that it's not a tack in the chair, but rather like there's a spring in the chair that has gone crazy and is now sticking up through the upholstery. And so if we're thinking about Saturn in Pisces, Saturn being structure, infrastructure, management, organization, this kind of thing, right? Then it's like, oh, I'm not going to be able to just move that tack and sit down comfortably. I'm going to have to take this whole damn chair apart in order to make this better for myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that is kind of like this wider story, right? And I see this. I've done a lot of like Saturn in Pisces readings for Saturn return people, for people who have Saturn in Pisces, and they're kind of like freaking out a little bit. And it's this sense of like, all right, there was this opening chapter that was Mars retrograde in Gemini that was maybe square to your natal Saturn in Pisces, or in a hard aspect to whatever mutable placements you have. And then now Saturn has come in and is like showing you the responsibility, the burden, the heartache perhaps, or this kind of thing, right? The sort of stuff that Saturn likes to talk about. So as Venus moves into Gemini, then this looks like it feels good for Gemini in some kind of way. Like it's hard on Venus because Venus has to deal with this square to Saturn, and there's also a trine to Pluto. You know, you can talk about a trine as like a is a trine supportive and beneficial, or is it to Pluto, and so is it going to be like more this kind of dysmorphic kind of thing? Like it, yes, seems like the answer to that to me. But so it's a little bit hard on the Venus stuff. So especially if we're looking at the things that are ruled by Venus, if we look at what's going on in Taurus, or if we look at what's going on in Libra, then those things look like they suffer a little bit. However, Gemini, whatever's been going on in Gemini, might get a little sweetness, might get a little bit of this, like, oh, this is nice, like we can cooperate, we can work together, things don't have to be terrible all the time, like maybe we can just like shift over a little bit and like let the like sometimes the pokey thing will like get catch you in your thigh or something like that, but it doesn't, you don't have to put all your weight on it every time,
Right.
and this kind of thing, right? Like maybe you can still sit down, you don't have to stand up for the next 3 years.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that too, like Venus potentially giving some of those Gemini placements or angles, some of like some soothing or some repair, or even like a sense of harmony, or
Mm-hmm.
even just like, yeah, fewer tacks in the chairs. Um, and I think that that could be after, Mars's pretty long overdue stay. And I think that in general, and thinking about sort of like Saturn now sort of having this big role with the mutable signs, and even like as Venus entering Gemini, like these mutable signs, like they're so shapeshifty, like they're always like iterating and iterating and iterating and changing in that way. And Saturn potentially providing a way that it's like iterating within some bounds that could make it potentially more useful, so that energy is better spent or better resourced or consolidated in some way. And I totally agree with all the things that you're saying, that like Venus herself and the things that the places that Venus is responsible for are now like a little less resourced or less Venusian potentially, but also like Gemini, I think the mutable signs in themselves as well may potentially feel really benefited by that presence.
Yeah, I would think so. I always think that Venus in Gemini feels sociable. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Venus in Gemini feels like a social butterfly to me, like the sense of like moving around and talking to all the
Totally
people
charming and
and
chatty. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, all that, right? And so, and that along with Saturn in Pisces, you know, this feels very creative, especially if we can remember that Mercury, who rules Gemini, is conjunct Uranus at this moment as well. And so there's something here about like sort of thinking outside the box, or breaking out of boundaries in some kind of way, that I think is likely beneficial to Gemini, which has probably felt restricted, reined in unable to do the thing, you know, from all the way from Mars retrograde. Like if Mars is the action planet and then Mars is moving backwards for a long time, then it's unable to move forward and do the thing that you want it to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then you get this Saturn square in here and it's like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. And then, you know, like Venus coming in and being ruled by that, and being nice, and then also being ruled by that Mercury who wants to like liberate with Uranus, and this kind of thing feels like ideas you hadn't had before, and this kind of thing. So it looks like a really good time for creative output for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And then we have the Sun and Jupiter seeming in
Mm.
Aries, which feels very exceptionally royal to me, like
Hmm.
looking at it. How are you thinking about the Sun Jupiter conjunction in Aries?
Yeah, it's very regal. It's very like, you know, this is a great time to do your sun things, whatever, you know. So like, and I think that, you know, we haven't quite gotten there yet as far as this forecast is concerned, but if we're thinking with these eclipses that are about to happen and this kind of thing, and then not only eclipses in Aries, but then also Pluto has moved into Aquarius, which is opposite to Leo, which is the sun's rulership, right? The sun's domicile. And so the sun is going to be in a weird place for the next 2 years or something like this. And so I've been thinking about the sun. So the sun being associated with like the self, the source, the light. You know, whenever I think about the sun or talk to talk to people about the sun, then I always talk about like the eyes. If you look into a person's eyes, then you can see that there's a person in there, or maybe you can see that they're crazy, and like there's this like truth in the eyes, right? And like this kind of essence. And we can also associate the sun with like famous faces or the face in general and this kind of thing. And so we've had a super solar moment historically in the past, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, something like this, where it's been all selfies. You know, it's like all pictures of my face. Here I am. If you were to go to my, if you were to go to the ZamboniFunk Instagram, then you would see a gang of pictures of my face on there. You
Just
know what I mean?
mugging.
And yeah, all the time, every day. And that's not uncommon for like content creators or people who are like, and then the whole thing is like, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And so that is, it looks like it wants to get weird in the coming years, in the next 2 years or so. However, before we get there, we've got this Sun Jupiter Kazemi at looking like it wants to do all of the most favorite sun things you could do. This looks like a real good time to double down on your selfie game, to you know, just do all the sun things that, like, if you can get into your own essence and your own ability to Aries the thing, to individuate, to go out and do stuff in the world and be, you know, like who you are specifically and put your character imprint out into the world, then this looks like a great time to do that.
Yeah, it feels like kind of exceptional heroism, or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And Jupiter kind of adding a sense of like extravagance to that, or even a sense of veneration to that, like thinking about that sort of like religion or religious connotation of Jupiter at times, this way that we like kind of venerate things and even like lifting up the royal thing even
Mm-hmm.
more. For some reason, this idea of like breaking world records was like coming to mind with
Oh
this,
yeah.
just this idea of like exceeding expectations with one's like brilliance and exceptional ability, was really something that was coming to mind, as something that just feels very like lucky and vital and exceeding expectations, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps really like
Amazing individual accomplishment.
totally, and like changing like our minds or our worldviews about like what we think is possible, and how, like how strong or special we can be or whatever, something like that. But um
Totally.
yeah, I think all of that. And also that too, in thinking about, all of this happening in Aries as well, where thinking about like the world of Aries is just this, it is interested in martial matters, which we could extrapolate to be things like effort and heroism, and like these like great athletic feats,
Mm.
and things like that. But then also like the worlds of war and weapons, and thinking about, you know, those things being like venerated. There's a way that we tend to not we people
Mm.
tend like honor or hold up or venerate sort of like war heroes, or these really like public, prominent, powerful, but
Mm-hmm.
they're venerated because of their martial effort, and sometimes linking to like conflict in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Was something that I was
Yeah,
thinking
so in a
about.
moment of uh widespread conflict, widespread geopolitical conflict, then we might see some of these kinds of feats taking place, like a major victory of some sort taking place, or something like this.
Yeah, and we're like, oh, you're the hero, but like, what does it mean to be like a hero in war? Like, what did you do? Things like that. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
okay. It's kind of it's complicated and conflicting in some way, but very visible and like praised nonetheless. So,
Yeah, it's interesting to see this Mars in Cancer here as well at the same time as this, right?
mhm.
Because Mars in Cancer, as I mentioned before, this is not Mars's favorite sign. And so when I'm thinking about Mars and war and this kind of thing, like Mars in Cancer looks like a difficult time in war, and if like if the war continues to drag on and this kind of thing, then it looks ugly. It looks like I don't feel like it. Like I don't like this. It doesn't feel comfortable in my body, and I don't want to do this anymore, and this kind of thing. So I wonder if that, as a context, might be uh, like a good backdrop for an individual to come out and sort of like lead the charge and annihilate the other guys or something like this.
Yeah, for
who are
sure.
also sad and hungry and stuff like that.
Yeah, and how often like food is very closely linked to who wins or loses in a
Big
war
time.
situation, like supplies and things like that, and how often in war a lot of like domestic burdens fall even greater on people who are at home caring for children and food and things like that.
Hmm.
So that'll
Hmm.
be, oh, it's an interesting little soup there. Is there anything else that you want to say? We kind of indirectly talked about Venus squaring Saturn as soon as Venus enters Gemini, but is there anything else that you want to say about these two happenings before we look towards week three?
I would say that, well, we spoke a little bit about Venus square Saturn from the Venus side of things, right? That's like a
Mm-hmm.
little tough on Venus and this sort of stuff, but it looks nice for Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Venus is likely to make, and this sort of gets back to the like really nice for creative output, or if we're thinking social butterflies or something like this, then we might think about cross pollination, like really good ideas coming from, like I'm in a musical space a lot, and so one of the things that people will tell you a lot is like, don't, if you're like searching through the sample database, then don't stick in your genre, like listen to the sounds that, like if you make meditation music, there might be a great sample waiting for you in the metal section, but
Yeah.
you gotta like look through those sounds and you might find something great in there. And so it's a really good time to um, work with people and ideas and things that are maybe outside of your regular fare. And you might come up with something really nice and something that can then inform your Saturn in some kind of way that can then, you can incorporate that into your structure, into your routines, into the ways that you consistently do your thing.
I agree. It's such a nice shift too in thinking like, as Mo was saying on a podcast from a couple months ago, like Saturn now has a boss as opposed to Saturn being the boss.
Hmm.
And it's so nice to see that in even just such a thing that we've been seeing so much, like, Venus square Saturn, which is something that happens relatively regularly. But then even this new iteration, since Saturn has changed signs, is like, well, now Saturn is in Venus's exaltation and Venus has a little more sway here. And normally when we're talking about Venus and Saturn, where we're talking about like what is the structure of our relationships and our responsibilities and our ideas and our creations. And now it's like, in the past few years, Saturn has been so like hard and heavy handed. It's like, no, it can't change. It has to be old and it has to stay fixed. And you have to keep your promises no matter what. And now it's more like now those things might be in favor of mutation or change or beauty over
Mm.
hardship in some way, or like just the value of something being hard um, isn't necessarily as important as maybe it was even just a few weeks ago, where Saturn's like, it's hard, therefore it's valuable. And now it's like, maybe it's different, therefore it's valuable, or it's beautiful, therefore it's valuable. And it feels like just having
Or
that sort of,
mysterious.
yeah, exactly, or imaginative or sacred, even, or poetic. It just feels like that change in tenor of that conversation feels really nice. And it feels like it'll be kind of evident here, that change in flavor.
Mm, mm, mhm.
And then from there, moving towards week three, having this kind of hybrid solar eclipse in Aries. So we had just a regular old new moon in Aries back in March, but now we're getting like, now it's getting closer to the nodes where we're starting to intersect a little bit with some of this eclipse flavor. And as you said earlier, that we'll be having eclipses in Aries and Libra for the next like over time in the next 2-ish years or so. There'll be a little bit of toggling, I think, for
Mm.
one cycle. And then from there, the sun's going to enter Taurus a few hours later. And you spoke earlier about, this lunation in Aries may feel very different than the one that we had in March. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this Aries lunation?
Sure. So, where the first Aries lunation was very strongly headed forward and wanted to do stuff and had that Jupiter saying yes to things and all this kind of thing. This one is an eclipse, and so it's important to remember that eclipses are moments of shadows, and so there's a kind of darkness or an uncertainty that is always associated with eclipses that is probably going to come through here in some kind of really important way. Also, it may be out of sign, but this is very closely square to Pluto as well. And so if we're thinking about Pluto, and we can think about underbelly, or the underworld, or like there's something shadowy, dark, difficult, rotting, stinky, composty about the way that Pluto likes to operate. And so that's going to introduce some of that kind of flavor into the area of Aries around this time. So it's a little too early to really see what's going on here, because the nodes haven't shifted yet, right? So the north node is still there in Taurus, and so there's still there's still Taurus Scorpio stuff to do. And then we're like, the next lunation that we've got is a full moon lunar eclipse in Scorpio, and so like that axis is still on. And so we're this Aries eclipse it's a little early to tell exactly where it's going to be going here, but I definitely do feel like there's going to be um like the solar stuff is going to get weird. There's going to be less of this ability to sort of shine out into the world and do the thing and all of this kind of stuff. And it just starts a whole new, when I think about eclipses, and I talk to people about eclipses a lot, then one of my favorite things to say about it is that it's often some kind of catalytic moment, where there like stuff might have been building for some time, and then you sort of like get to a point where there's a tipping point, and then it's like now the thing is going to sort of pour out. And so we might see some of that going on in Aries. And so Aries has been trying to build for a long time, has been, because we've had Jupiter there for a year at this point, right? So Jupiter's been going forth and back in this area for a little while, and trying to build things and trying to grow things. And Mars has been through this whole retrograde cycle, and Mars is ruling that Aries as well. So there's been this kind of like herky jerky forth and back kind of motion there as well, right? And so there's this feeling of like, I really want it to go, but then because it's an eclipse and shadowy and uncertain and this kind of thing, it's likely to move, but perhaps not in the direction that you thought forward was. And it's, if we're getting into the north node and this kind of thing, then there might be like a hungry ghost kind of situation here. It's never enough. There's, like, I thought it was going to move forward, but instead it's moving in this weird direction, in this oblique direction that I did not see coming. And so, but I still wanted to go forward. So now I got to push on it even harder, and this kind of stuff. Like I would expect some of that to come through here.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of times, like a lot of energy with North Node stuff is also just frustrating, like because it is never
Mm,
satiated. There is this like element or this sense of frustration um around it too. And then I use the word like oblique, like moving like forward is now like oblique, or even in like sort of like in beams with Pluto, sort of like, or maybe like going forward is now underground or something like that. What is it to like attempt to shine brightly, but it's underground or like hidden in some way?
mm,
Which
mm-hmm,
feels like it could like inform some of that potential frustration. But then there's also people who shine quite well in underground, thinking about people. I mean, I'm going extreme here, but thinking about sort of like mafia, or like people who are just like really like doing a lot of like underground exchanges, or having this underground power or wealth in those kinds of
mm,
ways.
mm.
So,
Yeah, that's interesting, especially if we've got a next eclipse coming up in Scorpio.
mhm.
Um, and gangsters are famously extremely emotional people,
Yeah.
and it's not there's this push away from that, to like do business and this kind of thing, but like a moment of disrespect will get a gangster so mad at you that like now we have to we're going
You
to
have to be
war with your
annihilated.
whole neighborhood. Yeah, over this one moment, once somebody said one thing one time or something like that. And again, maybe it wasn't that one thing, maybe that was the straw that broke the camel's back or something like this, right? And so and then we've got that in the context of geopolitical dynamics and these kinds of things, like there's and power plays, like I'm I feel like there's like territorial conquest to be had here through this eclipse season.
For sure. I was thinking that earlier too, when we were talking about Mercury and Taurus and that immediate square to Pluto too, sort of like these material things and like moving them underground and like what does that look like? But now I think we're kind of talking about it now, potentially. So I think you're really contextualizing that in a way that feels really true for me.
Mm.
And then the sun moves into Taurus within a few hours, which is a pretty different vibe for the sun. You know, the sun in Taurus potentially more concerned with comfort and enjoyment rather than excelling in, you know, heroic and daring feats of bravery. Perhaps less inclined to move or less inclined to take risks. Definitely a change in pace for sure. And it also just feels interesting. To me, I'm sort of thinking of it, the sun is sort of just like eclipse, and it has some of that underground quality, and then it sort of travels underground and then bubbles back up in Taurus,
Mm.
which is an interesting vibe. How are you thinking about that transition?
Sure. Well, yeah. So the sun moving into Taurus is also going to have this square to Pluto and a sextile to Saturn in Pisces, right? So definitely underground makes a lot of sense there. The sense of like um, going through the darkness phase, like a place where you can't see my face, and then going through something transformative with Pluto there, and then Saturn there as well. So, uh, been talking about Saturn as being good for creative output and this kind of thing, like with that square to Venus and this and all that sort of stuff going on here. And that Saturn as well has been feeding the sun, in the same way that, like, so Jupiter Kazemi, it was feeding the sun, right? Well, Jupiter is ruling Saturn in Pisces, and so that means that whatever Saturn's doing is likely to feed into that regal sun thing as well here, right? And so then as the sun sort of moves into that sextile dynamic, like a sextile that's complementary, right? It's the water of Saturn or Pisces wants to nourish the earth that is the sun in Taurus. And so then there's but then like there's also this eclipse dynamic, and it's Pluto and it's Saturn water, right? So Saturn water, is there vinyl chloride in the water? Like, maybe. you know and so
Is Saturn trying
there's
to build a dam?
Oh yeah, sure, sure. That oh, I hadn't even thought of damming. That's a real big Saturn in the water word, isn't
It
it?
is, yeah. But
So,
anyways, I wasn't trying to interrupt.
no, no, that's real good. That's a nice image. So there's definitely, like, I don't know, the whole thing is kind of ambivalent a little bit, I'm of two minds about the whole thing, but um yeah, like I feel like a lot of this month is just getting to know Pluto in Aquarius and Saturn in Pisces. We're just getting some aspects to those planets and seeing what they can do, seeing what kind of things will happen if you poke Saturn in Pisces. What is it going to give you? And so this is a good time to, if you're especially if you have late Aries or early Taurus placements or angles or something like this is probably a real good time to do some journaling or something like that. Like, especially getting into the places that are difficult in your mind to get to, then this is probably a good time to kind of like let that out a little bit. I always like a journal because a journal is not going to judge you in the way that even your friend or your mom or someone who really loves you might judge you or have expectations of you that are sort of outside of yourself or this kind of thing. Journal's not going to do that. A journal is just going to sit there and receive whatever it is that you have, right? So you can sort of let it out in that space. It's probably a good time for something like automatic writing or this kind of thing, where you can kind of get into this more spiritual or unconscious kind of place and see what kinds of things flow out from there and what kind of utility you might be able to derive from that across this longer 2 years ish cycle.
Yeah, totally. And I like the use the getting poked. Like we're getting a lot of these sort of like foretaste or first tastes. I don't know enough about
Mhm.
fine dining to know exactly what that course is called, whatever that like little pre special thing that you're getting. Um, yeah, getting a lot of like information, even with that sort of with that eclipse, the baby eclipse in Aries. Like we're getting sort of this little taste of like what that's gonna do. This a little taste of what Saturn and Pisces is gonna do in Aquarius. So I think um it's sort of like we're easing into what these greater transitions are and starting to like get some information about what their implications are in the world outside, but also how it's interacting with our own chart and our own placements and what we could potentially expect personality wise from those
Mm-hmm.
changes. Um, and then on April 21st, we have Mercury stationing retrograde, which is, a fan favorite for astro forecasts. And
Sure.
yeah,
Right there
so
with the eclipse, also right there on Uranus. Like this looks like a major Mercury station.
yeah, it definitely
This
looks
one looks
like
like
one.
it wants to do stuff.
It's not one to miss. So do you want to have any
Sure.
more
You're not
thoughts
going to be
about
able to
that?
miss it, I don't think.
Yeah, I think it will be unmissable for sure. I feel like it's going to have a very like amped stereotypical Mercury retrograde vibe, but potentially like that intersection of technology and how it messes up our sort of like more embodied material logistics and problems that we're always trying to stay on top of. How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, big time. I mean, if we're thinking about technology impeding embodied experience, then it's like there's a big potential here for showing up at the wrong place at the wrong time. You know what I mean? Like I really thought that this was when we were gonna meet, but but then look and maybe even look back and be like, oh, this is what this says, and then but like maybe it's the wrong time zone or the other person slept on it or something like that. Like all type of that sort of stuff is really likely to happen here. Miscommunications of all sorts look like they want to happen here. I Uranus and Taurus, I'm wondering if there might be something like volcanic that wants to go on
Mm,
here, or earthquakey or something like this, like land shifting,
mhm,
land moving in a direction that you didn't think that the land was going to move, you
mm.
know? And so that could be literal in the sense of earthquakes or this kind of thing, but then also I wonder if there's like a metaphorical landscape that might change. Again, if we're thinking about geopolitical territory conquest and this kind of thing, we might see some borders moving in one direction or the other, maybe in a direction that you hadn't expected or something like this. Something happens that shifts the field, like shifts the field in terms of the ground, but then also like the field of resource and value and this kind of stuff that really wants to change things in a really major way, um, and in an unexpected way, and also associated, like fairly close to the North Node and fairly close to a square to Pluto. Like we're far enough from that square to Pluto that's like 15 degrees or something like that. Like astro.com isn't going to draw you the line on that,
Right.
but a whole sign aspect to this, and I think the Pluto station is sometime in the next couple of days also. So like, and then anytime there's an outer planet stationing, then you like got to give it some breadth there. Like it's uh, stuff wants to take place here, and it might not be. It's likely to be heavyweight, and it might not always be easy to see.
Yeah, I think the currency is coming to mind a lot as you're
Ooh,
talking
yeah,
about
for
that.
sure.
And even, those is maybe like echoing some of the Pluto and Aquarius things. Like I think money is definitely something that's going to be going to continue to undergo a lot of like change with that
Yeah,
larger
and
cycle.
marketplaces in general, I feel like
Exactly. Like
I've heard a
what
lot of
does
people.
commerce look like?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talking about like the dating marketplace or the sexual marketplace and this kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing, right? Like the sense of like, am I able to give to you the thing that you want from me, and are you going to give to me the thing that I want, and this kind of thing, and like what really matters to us. That sort of thing looks like it really wants to be in a serious place of flux here.
For sure. A word that I was using a lot talking about March was seismic. This idea like things kind of like
Hmm.
seismically shifting. And it feels like this is sort of riding on the back of the wave with that idea of like something like just kind of disruptive and earthly and yeah, shifty in us in around things and in areas of charts that don't like to be shifted very much or aren't prone to shifting on their own usually, but have to sort of be disrupted into change.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a little bit like if your money doesn't work the same way that it used to, then what would you do?
Right.
Like, you probably don't stop exchanging goods and services, right? You do something else rather than using US dollars or whatever, right? You do something else. And because you still have something valuable and other people still have valuable things that you need. And so, like, how do we navigate that? And so there's a whole Mercury retrograde. So it's not just about this moment, right? Then there's 3 weeks of reevaluating that. That's going to have to go on. That is, it seems like some shit's going to go down during that 3 weeks.
For sure. Whereas like the initial exclamation point might be like, "Ooh, so sudden." It might like the actual like play out, play back, play through, solving all of that is gonna like be something that we integrate in over the course of the next several weeks.
Sure. And it's also worth noting that it's at 16 degrees of Taurus, which is also an eclipse point. So the last eclipse
Mhm.
that we had in Taurus happened right at that spot. And so we did just have a North Node eclipse in Aries that might sort of mean that we're sort of out of the window of that last eclipse, but I'm not so sure of that with that. It's so on point. And
Might
we're
still be
right in the
some
middle of eclipse
sprinkles.
season. Say again?
And have some sprinklings of it left on this
Sure.
drink. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Salt Bay.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense. So I think it's definitely a Mercury RX to watch for sure.
For sure.
Um, is there anything else? I mean, we'll have the sun conjoin the North Node exactly a few days later. Is that something you want to discuss, or do you feel like we've already sort of like touched on it as we've talked about other things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the sun conjunct the North Node is likely to be historically noteworthy. You know, if you've got something at 3 or 4 degrees of Taurus, then that'll probably be a moment for you specifically. But like, in the sort of mundane or historical landscape, that's a thing that happens. You know, it's definitely not the biggest thing.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about like the flavors of how that North Node is sort of infiltrating all these different things as we've talked through different transits over the month. And
Mm-hmm.
is there anything else that you feel like, as we're on the other end of talking through April 2023, what are sort of your like broad, big picture um, frameworks or frames for how you're sort of looking at this month?
Hmm. This looks like a month of. So if we return to the frame that I had originally, which is like the beginning of this 200-year cycle and the beginning of this 20-year cycle and the beginning of this 3-year cycle, then um, it's good to and we think about that along with like what happens if you poke Saturn, what happens if you poke Pluto, and this kind of thing, right? There's a and with such strong Uranus stuff going on here as well, it's like there's a sense of experimentation, there's a sense of trial and error that's going on here. Like, we were very used to Saturn being super strong. Saturn was in amazing dignity, right there with Pluto, even, you know what I mean? Just like the most Saturn that could ever Saturn happened for the past 5 years. And so we've gotten really used to that. And then as we move into April, we don't have that Saturn anymore. And one great point that Palace made on the quarterly forecast is now when you try to do your Saturn stuff, you're with in Aquarius and stuff, you're instead of getting Saturn, you're going to get Pluto. And so how does that feel instead, right? And so it feels a little bit to me like it, if you are concerned about things, then you might feel like you want to get more rigid, like you want more barriers and boundaries, and you want it to be more like, I want to control it a little better and like know what's happening and this kind of thing. But even that word control, like, it leads us into Pluto, and so it might get a little twisted, or like it might go in a direction that could be maybe a little more dark or distorted than you had, or rotten than you had been thinking when you were thinking, oh, I'm going to do Saturn, I'm going to do organization and management and efficiency and stuff like this. So I would approach this month with a feeling of a scientist. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what's going to happen here. I think stuff like, think about a brand new baby, right? Like if I drop something, okay, it went down that time, but I don't necessarily know that it's going to go down every time. I got to drop this thing a bunch of times. And not only am I testing to see if stuff falls down every time, but I'm also testing to see how many times this person is going to pick it back up for me and
Yeah.
this sort of stuff, right? Like a constant experimentation going on at all times in all directions. And I feel like that is a really good way to sort of orient ourselves in this month where there, like March happened and big shifts took place, and now we're in this new world. And so how do we do that? What are the rules of this new world? If I drop it, is it going to fall every time? It may not. And
Mm.
so approaching with that kind of sense of experimentation, I think, is a good way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, experimentation and like agility, like things change. And
Mm,
in ways,
flexibility for
yeah,
sure.
exactly. I agree with all of that. Well, thank you for kind of walking through this month and like shining your light on your perspectives and stories and analogies that I know will be super helpful for people as they're navigating it in real life. Where can people find out more about you, more about your work? Is there anything that you have coming up that you want people to know about? How do you like people to stay in touch with you on the interwebs?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here. This has been a fun conversation. Folks can always go to ZamboniFunk.com. That's the single hub where you can find all the stuff. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and stuff like that. All that is linked up at ZamboniFunk.com. You can find me on Spotify, Tidal, Pandora. You can check out the music there. That is also linked up at ZamboniFunk.com. I would really love if people would go and listen to the music. Yes, I do astrology and stuff, and I like to think that I have interesting things to say about the times that we live in and this kind of thing. But I really feel like the thing that I'm most proud of in the world is the music that I've been able to create. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if you want to do that, there's a breathing exercise that just came out a little while ago. It's called Breathe. It's in the style of Wim Hof breathing,
Mm-hmm.
but the I didn't really like his video that much. The music was like a little off. The music didn't follow the breath in a way that I wanted to. His voice was a little too far for. I was like super nitpicky in a musician kind of way, and
Mm-hmm.
so I was just like trying to be the change that I wanted to see in the world, and so
Let's
I
do
just
it.
made another one. I used what I do. I already know how to make music, and I know how to do it in a sort of spiritual context and this kind of thing. And so I made a breathing exercise. It's called Breathe. You can find it on Bandcamp. You can find it on Amazon Music, Deezer, Apple Music. I always forget. There's like a long list of platforms. Wherever you like to get your music, YouTube, it's in that place. And so if people would check that out and just try it one time, even if you don't breathe along with it, the music is pretty good. Joanna Macy has a feature on there, so
Nice.
I would love it if folks would listen.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to share all of those things in the show notes below so people can find them really easily and click through super easily. And thanks again, not only for sharing your astro perspectives and your stellar perspectives, but also just the work that you're putting out in the world, which, in my opinion, art making is also change that we're making in the world. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate what you're doing here.